Welcome back. I'm Waqar Rizvi, and you're still watching Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss the raid on Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt and its worldwide repercussions. On the heels of the Panama Papers revelations, authorities have accused certain bank employees of money laundering, one who even worked in the anti-financial crime office. Will Donald Trump's loans from Deutsche Bank now come back to haunt him? To discuss all those issues a bit further, we're now joined by Yannis, who is a European affairs analyst who's joining us live now via Skype. And we're also joined by Markus, who is joining us live now from Marburg in Germany, and he's the director of financial secrecy. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Yannis, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What did you make of the raid on Deutsche Bank and its many repercussions?
Well, it's a very serious implication for Deutsche Bank because it's the second incident in a few weeks after the affair with Danske Bank and the laundering of billions of euros from the Estonian branch of Danske Bank. Deutsche Bank has been in the eye of the inspectors for many months now, even years, since the start of the Panama Papers crisis, and it seriously damages the reputation of the bank, who is now in a new management and tries to have a new start after all the problems of the previous years.
And so, Markus, why do you think it is that Deutsche Bank hasn't been able to get a hold of these many scandals?
Since then, they have posted on their websites services related to tax neutrality or the privacy and confidentiality of the clients. And this, of course, is attracting that sort of clientele which is in the banking for hiding of activities which can be labeled criminal or illicit at the very least. And furthermore, you should not forget that Germany bribery payments abroad from the German tax base. So this combined, you see what kind of client base the Deutsche Bank probably still has in its books after those decades of unashamed offshore activity, of undermining other jurisdictions' tax and integrity of the economies.
Right, and Yannis, just before coming for this recording, I was reading a statement that the Transparency International sent out a press release about this issue and about the Deutsche Bank raid, and saying that as G20 leaders are right now meeting in Argentina, as you well know, they haven't yet done enough to fight corruption and to fight against these shell companies which fuel that sort of corruption. Do you agree with the need, obviously, for G20 to make this a priority as well?
Well, certainly it is a priority because in recent years we've seen numerous reports of illicit transactions from financial institutions that are billions and billions of euros and dollars being shelved in offshore accounts. The European Union has done some remarkable work in the previous year. It has put much pressure on offshore jurisdictions, and many of these jurisdictions have complied to transparency, but not all, and there is still much work to do. But we should be aware that all these affairs that have come up with Deutsche Bank are legacy affairs from previous years, where the eyes of the financial world and the inspectors were not so much in these offshore accounts and these financial institutions. So we may see many more incidents coming up, washing up in the next months. But I think we are now in a position to say the fight against illegal transactions is in a good way.
Do you agree with that, Markus? Do you think that the EU has bought in enough or has done enough at this point in time to ensure that going forward, at the very least, the fight against corruption is more effective?
Well, I would say yes and no. The agenda is set and there are the right issues discussed, but countries such as Germany are dragging their feet, unfortunately. We are proposing the ABC of tax transparency in order to fight this offshore scourge and these problems related to it, be it corruption, money laundering, or tax evasion on a mind-boggling scale. The A stands for automatic information exchange, and here, for example, we have made progress, but the problem is that you are not allowed, if you exchange that tax data data among tax administrations to use that data for corruption prosecutions. That's a big problem, and we have to urgently address that. In the B is the beneficial ownership disclosure of companies, trusts, and foundations, that the real owners controlling those entities in public registers. This is on the way, but not robustly enough and not across the world yet. And the C, finally, is the country-by-country reporting, public disclosure of what multinational companies do in each country. Once we have those in place, we have a far better chance to win this fight against a global problem that is at the heart of the global economy, which is undermining the democracies and market economies across the globe.
Okay, so let's talk about the worldwide implications, Yannis, for a moment, because as you well, the issue of Donald Trump and his loans from Deutsche Bank have now come into play. And that's been spoken about a lot right now on social media ever since this raid took place yesterday. What do you make of that entire issue, Yannis?
Well, I expect there will be more revelations in the next days. Just last night, there was a report on BuzzFeed News that the Trump Trust decided to, in 2016, to make a bargain with Vladimir Putin and give him a present of a penthouse in the Trump Tower in Moscow that was supposed to be built under very shady circumstances. So there was business from Mr. Trump in Russia, although he has denied that in his pre-election speeches. And also there are many more institutions that are involved with the subprime activities of Deutsche Bank. So there has to be a very thorough investigation of to which extent Deutsche Bank is involved in these shady transactions. But we should be aware that it's not only Deutsche Bank. There are financial institutions, especially in Asia, that are very, very shady in their transactions. So it's not just Deutsche Bank. It's a worldwide phenomenon.
And Markus, what do you make of the connection with Trump as well? Because it's been spoken about that, why would Deutsche Bank give him a loan at a time that most American banks refused, at a time in the early 2000s when he was, or a lot of his properties were going into bankruptcy. Why did Deutsche Bank at that point agree to give him the loan? What exactly was that deal like?
Well, obviously that is pure speculation, so I am not best placed to comment on this. I mean, it is one hypothesis that now the raid had been perhaps also triggered by that Trump connection. Another hypothesis, another rumor is that it might be triggered through the connections with H&A, the Chinese conglomerate. There are some actors entertaining accounts with Deutsche Bank. So the real signal this is sending to the rest of the world, this raid at the moment, is an important one, because it shows for the first time that a country goes after its own major bank for money laundering offenses. This has not happened, as far as I'm concerned, at least not in Germany. German prosecutors were fast in going after their own tax affairs and prosecuting their own tax losses at banks, for example, as well, or German banks were prosecuted by U.S. or foreign agencies for money laundering, but never before German banks have been subject to investigations for money laundering for hosting the looted assets of nations from abroad. And this is a novelty that I hope will spread across the world, and which will dispel that notion of hypocrisy that has clouded the fight against money laundering globally in the past, that you would rather preserve your own dirty business at home, but go after the small ones, the small players from abroad, in order to maintain the business model of hosting that looted money in your own economy.
Okay, let's talk about that business model then, Yannis, because I imagine that many countries, or I should say some countries, would not be as willing as Germany has been, as Markus there pointed out, to go after its own banks. How then does one come to a global system where you can ensure, or at least try to ensure, that money laundering is tackled, corruption is tackled?
Understanding, because if even in the European Union there is a discussion right now to have a closer corporate tax regime rather to have rates between 10 and 30%. So if we can come up with a solution on G20 level, then that would be the best idea. But I don't see that coming for the next decades. There are jurisdictions and even economies that depend on very, very low taxation that is enabling money to transfer from high taxation countries to low taxation. So there's no political will to come to this point. That's my understanding.
Exactly, and that's a good point that you brought up, Yannis, which I want to you, Markus. Do you think the political will exists? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about money. We're talking about very large banks here with very wide influence across the world, such as Deutsche Bank or others that we can possibly talk about as examples as well. Do you think politicians will really be as willing to go after them?
I think we have seen in the past a remarkable trend. The G8 summit in 2013 put on the agenda the ABC of tax transparency, which I just mentioned, which was ridiculed a few years only ago as being totally unrealistic. So I think this political will to enter into reforms for real transparency in the financial system and sector depends to a large extent on the public pressure, on the civil society engagement by journalists, by academics to look hard at the issues and don't be satisfied with very superficial responses given by politicians. And also we should not be lured into the excuse that you can only take action against this internationally. No, that's not true. European Union, for example, and even Germany would have sufficiently clout through its market to leverage its market access to enforce transparency standards across the globe. And this is an encouraging signal. I agree that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so we do not know yet if finally these prosecutions will actually go forward and will lead to convictions, or if they will be stopped, as they have been often in the past, by political interventions. But at the moment it is looking really bright. This is an encouraging signal that countries can take action against criminal loot, against the underground offshore economy, the financial secrecy globally, even if it is happening in their own banks, and I hope the other nations will follow suit on this.
Okay, so Yannis, in 2008 we had that huge financial crisis globally. We're right now in 2018. Do you think that the world has done better when it comes to dealing with this money laundering, this corruption? And just the fact that people back in 2008, I remember the narrative was that these banks have simply become too large for their own good and for anybody else's good.
Well, certainly we've come a long way. If we go back to the early 2000s, we can see that offshore jurisdictions were operating with almost no checks and balances. Now we're at certainly a different point, but still we're not in a point that we say we can be satisfied with how things are. To give you an example, there was a legislation lately in the US Congress to deregulate the American banking system, which is a very, very dangerous approach to my understanding. And also in other countries, because there are legacy issues with banks, governments are very reluctant to open up the investigations because they don't really know what kind of skeletons that might come out of the coffins of these banks that will affect overall economy. So it's a gradual approach. There has to be pressure. I totally agree with Markus on his approach, and we should all be aware that the pressure needs to be maintained on a daily basis, not just because yesterday there was a raid on Deutsche Bank, but every single day.
Okay, so I wanted to add another voice to this conversation, gentlemen. We're now joined by Mr. Muzammil Aslam, who is joining us live on the line now from the Pakistani city of Karachi, and he's ex-CEO of investment banking. Muzammil, thanks for joining us in the scope. Muzammil, as you well know, the Panama Papers had quite an impact when it came to Pakistan specifically as well. Just give us an idea about what your thoughts were as you heard about the raid that took place at Deutsche Bank yesterday.
I think that is pretty much in line with the policy of U.S. Federal Reserve and the other investigative agencies. if you go back in the past, it's not just Deutsche Bank. Recently, they have been inquiring with UFG Bank of Japan, and if you recall, not many months ago, they have penalized Habib Bank Habib Bank Limited of Pakistan. Apart from that, if you go back 2-3 years, so they have penalized Barclays Bank, HSBC banks, and their investigation is ongoing. And they have not been tolerating any, the evidences if they found regarding the money laundering or AML, anti-money laundering. So this is not a surprise move. And I'm sure Deutsche Bank, they must have done something and they will be penalized the way other banks were penalized.
Okay, so Muzammil, just for a moment, let's talk about the Panama Papers' direct impact on Pakistan. As we well know, a sitting prime minister was investigated, as well as his family members, for corruption and for the revelations that came out in that. What are your thoughts about what kind of an impact that has had on this country specifically?
I think Pakistan has already faced the issue, and there is nothing much left in terms of Panama Papers. The Prime Minister is gone, Habib Bank got penalized. The other bank just recently announced UBL, they're going to shut their New York business, so they will not be operating in US anymore. So there is nothing much left as far as Pakistan is concerned.
Okay, so Markus, I wanted to bring you in because the reason that I brought up Donald Trump earlier is because we've looked at, of course, Markus, the example of the impact of Panama Papers on Pakistan, where a sitting prime minister was removed from office, his family members also being held responsible for the revelations that came out from those papers, revelations of overseas properties, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that we will see such a large impact on other countries as well in the coming days, months, years?
First and foremost from this is now that Deutsche Bank might not remain the only German bank to be investigated, because it appears to signal a shift in the German prosecuting strategy rather than necessarily novelties in terms of what data came to light. The German Federal Crime Fighting Agency, BKA, has been offering publicly since last year to any interested nation the sharing of the full Panama data set, which they purchased from an unknown source. And that would be certainly an interesting angle now for administration. As far as I'm aware, it's been predominantly European nations that requested access to that data set, but that should be something that could be closely followed up on by Pakistan, by other nations across the world to ensure that these kind of activities come to light.
We said this is a very powerful signal, Yannis, but I'm wondering, and I don't want to just keep going back to Donald Trump, but he's providing a good example here, isn't he, of how this all may play out in the coming days, months, possibly even years. How do you think that men such as Donald Trump or others around the world are right now viewing this situation? What exactly do you think is happening behind the scenes? Are deals, do you think, being made?
Businessmen or financial institutions that are familiar with this system are adapting their operations to new standards and the new situation. I think no one is taking so many risks anymore that they used to take in previous years. And this is one of the positive developments from these revelations and all these investigations. I don't think that anyone now is so risky to go and hide money just like that in offshore accounts. Of course, there are many other ways to make money laundering, but things are much more difficult right now, and this is, as I said, a very good signal.
Very well, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there as our final word, but of course appreciate all of your insights as you've shared on this very important topic. That was Yannis Kotsomidis, a European Affairs Analyst who was speaking to us live via Skype. We were also joined by Markus Meinzer, who was speaking to us live from Marburg in Germany, Director of Financial Secrecy, who was also joining us on the line. And we were also joined earlier by Muzammil Aslam, speaking to us live from Karachi, and he was on call from that port city. He is the ex-CEO of investment banking. Now, as all of the above mentioned viewers viewers, this issue of financial corruption, this issue of money laundering is a very vast one. And it's a process of sorts, which we've seen in place, especially since the Panama Papers revelations, but even possibly all the way starting back in 2008 with that financial crisis. We'll, of course, have to see how all of this plays out. We've seen the huge impact it's had on Pakistan, for example, and how now there is a very large anti-corruption drive in this country, which continues, as well as now seemingly in Europe and other places. We'll keep a very close eye on all developments, but thank you for watching Scope for today. I've been Waqar Rizvi.